What do you think the future does look like more specifically for humanitarian efforts or just civilian ships? Is it just a case we could see piracy happening, threats, sort of ships being boarded by Iranian soldiers because of the leverage that they can gain? Is this just the way things are going to be now?
I think that any ship going through the strait is going to be under a lot of risk from the Iranians, whether that's from, missile and drone attacks if the conflict is escalating again, to just them boarding and just being aggressive and intimidating and, kind of looking around and throwing the captain's stuff around and then, kicking over a chair and leaving. They have a lot of leverage over the strait at the moment, and they have a lot of reason to keep this going.
This is the Global Gambit.
Undervalued in coverage is maritime warfare. Now, when we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, or indeed Russia and Ukraine and the Black Sea, or perhaps Russia's probing around the UK, for example, we sort of touch upon it, but increasingly it has relevance. Indeed, the use of drones in the disproportionate changes to warfare, agility of, say, weaker powers or those going up against a much larger force. Think Iran's capacity against the United States or Ukraine's capacity against Moscow. And so that's what I wanted to look at today, is in a exciting, I think, two-parter, cheeky little conversation. I know some of you like that, some of you don't, but well, it means that you're going to have to come back, subscribe for part 2, right? No, but we're being joined today by Dr. Emma Salisbury, who's a senior fellow in the National Security Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, or FPRI, an institute where we've had a couple of other staff members. And she's also a contributing editor at the great publication War on the Rocks. And indeed, she's been covering the Strait of Hormuz, but also, of course, the Black Sea. And I thought it'd be interesting to get an understanding of how those two theatres vary and what we can learn from both, especially considering one theatre's been going a lot longer than the other. Emma, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we're going to start off, I think, with part 1 on the Strait of Hormuz, given the timeliness of it, and then shift towards Ukraine and Russia for the second half. So just getting a sense of the past, what is it now? I think we're approaching 120 days with the war in Iran. I mean, some people claim it's still ongoing. I don't think it is as such now, but the MOU is a pretty lackluster document for the United States. But in the time that the real intense combat was happening, how are you feeling about it and looking at the Strait of Hormuz? And then we can get into some more specifics.
I think the thing that really stood out to me with this conflict was that Trump just assumed that he could go in all guns blazing and get exactly what he wanted really, really quickly. Obviously, that did not pan out as he hoped it would. And that meant that Iran would obviously immediately use its leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. This is a deeply predictable thing. It's been a part of all of the Pentagon's war planning for a war with Iran ever since 1970. So I think the thing that really stood out to me was how surprised the Trump administration seemed to be about Iranian actions in the Strait of Hormuz, despite this level of predictability. And I think it's because they were overconfident and thought they could just win really, really quickly and wouldn't have to deal with it. But then once that didn't occur, what we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz, or what was developing over the last weeks and months, is maritime warfare in a very limited geographical area that's deeply, deeply affecting geopolitical trade, and the trade routes that go through there are very, very important for the rest of the world. So we're seeing how kind of strait warfare can disrupt global trade, but also show that a country that doesn't have as much military capability as a big superpower can still really make an impact on that superpower.
No, I think that's an interesting aspect to this is just how much the Iranians seem to have been able to leverage their smaller capabilities in a very effective way. It makes me think about just how important geography is and sometimes overlooked in conflict. And Iran, I think, has one of the most effective landscapes really for natural defenses and deterrence like that. But just on the IRGC capabilities, what did they actually have, and how much did the United States actually destroy their navy or undermine it, incapacitate it? Because there seems to be, perhaps deliberately, varying degrees of claims about this.
So with the first set of airstrikes that the US and Israel did on Iran, they did manage to destroy quite a lot of Iran's conventional military forces. So most of Iran's navy is at the bottom of the sea at the moment. So it's frigates, destroyers, that kind of traditional naval platforms. They were all in port and they got struck by missiles and sunk. So the traditional Iranian navy was hit and destroyed very quickly. Doesn't really have an air force. The couple of planes they had were also destroyed very quickly. So what has been left and what has been causing problems for the US and Israel is not those conventional military assets, it's missiles and drones. So essentially the capability that Iran has been relying on is being able to launch missiles and drones from its huge landmass that borders onto the Strait of Hormuz, and then to be able to move those launches and hide them. So if you have a missile launcher, you can only destroy it if you can find it. And if you can use that launcher very quickly, pack it up and move it, then your adversary is not going to be able to destroy it. And then you can move it somewhere else, fire more, pack it up, move it again. So it's sort of this almost guerrilla warfare tactic of striking, moving. And that is much more difficult for the US and Israel to deal with because they are relying on airstrikes mostly to be able to destroy these capabilities. And that's exactly what these capabilities are good at hiding from. So the Iranian military capability is quite limited in terms of numbers of different capabilities, but the ones they have are the ones that are the most useful in this moment for them.
Well, I've seen some people call it a mosquito fleet, that they're heavily armored, but they're high speed, like small maritime craft, right? Like bog hammers, or just some would just call them missile boats. Could you break that down a little bit more and how they've been able to use that against the US despite the particular main parts of their navy being destroyed?
Sure. So it's sort of a similar concept that you have a lot of small things that can be easily hidden. So these boats can be just pulled into a small inlet or beached or hidden in the rocks and dispersed all the way along the coastline. So that means, again, there's lots of very small hidden targets that are very difficult for the US and Israel to hit with conventional airstrikes. What these boats do is they can swarm a naval target and they will be armed with things like torpedoes or other missiles, and they can also be crewed with soldiers or marines, so they can board vessels. You can also have them controlled remotely. So essentially what Iran will do is get one of these small boats, pack it with explosives and drive it into the side of a ship. And so it's essentially a really big remote controlled torpedo. And all of these, there are thousands of these things, and it's really difficult for the US to keep surveillance on them and to alert shipping to danger because they are such small targets and there are so many of them. So it means that Iran has it has all of these options available to it with all of these small vessels. But then it can, if it's not using them, it can hide them so they can't be hit while they're in port. And this is the same with their submarine fleet. So they have what's called midget submarines, which are much, much smaller than the traditional ones that we think about. But they are really good for the shallow waters of the Strait of Hormuz. And what that means is that the Iranians can lay mines or fire torpedoes from these very small submarines with a lot more stealth to them than you'd expect from a much bigger submarine in that tighter space because they are so small. So that also adds another layer to their capabilities. And then they also have their drones and missiles being fired from the land, which then give air cover to those operations as well. So it's quite a complicated picture, but none of these capabilities are particularly complicated or like technologically advanced. They just have a lot of them and they're really easy to hide.
But can we not just agree, therefore, that this was an abject failure of the United States in this effort to weaken or destroy and decapitate the Islamic Republic and the government? Because it's
completely.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's a loaded question, but deliberately so, because a lot of people agree from across the political spectrum. What I think is fascinating is that Trump seems to have been able to single-handedly bring everybody together, be the former MAGA supporters, liberals, traditional conservatives, radical leftists, I don't know, the entire political spectrum being like, yeah, this was a bad idea. Would you agree with that, or you think there's more that the US achieved which isn't being recognized?
I think this is a complete strategic defeat for
Wow.
the US. It's been baffling to me and to my colleagues in the think tank world and, any right-thinking person how stupid this was as an idea. And basically what Trump has managed to do is use up huge amounts of the US's missile stocks and interceptor stocks, put loads of troops in danger, get, I think it's 13 or 14 US service members killed. They've lost planes, they've lost helicopters, they've lost all sorts of assets. And all that has happened is that Iran now has control of the Strait of Hormuz, which it didn't have before. The regime has been not replaced, but strengthened because the leaders are now younger and just as hardline. And the people of Iran have not been helped at all. And so what Trump has done is gone in, blown a load of stuff up and made everything worse. And Iran has actually come out of this in a lot better position than it went in. And to think about what Trump was talking about when he began this war, he didn't have a strategic goal for this. He didn't have a reason for this to be happening. You know, the US military has done its best, and, you know, the US military is a deeply professional military with really good tech and assets and people, and they have done their best. But with this kind of strategic direction, there's only so much they can do. So I think what has happened is that Trump he got really overconfident. He thought he could bomb Iran into submission because he had just gone into Venezuela and taken Maduro with no consequences. And I think he got overconfident and thought that, you know, he could go in, bomb Iran would capitulate, give him everything he wanted. And now he's got himself into another quagmire in the Middle East, which the US is very good at doing. So I think that if you look at this in the round, there is nothing that the US has gained from this whatsoever.
But shouldn't more culpability be aimed at the Israelis for persuading, incentivizing, manipulating Trump into getting involved in this war?
Absolutely. I think a lot of blame falls at the feet of Netanyahu for this, because it seems from the reporting that Netanyahu went to Trump and essentially flattered him and said, you know, sir, you'll be the greatest president in the history of the world if we can get this done. And it worked. And, you know, I don't think, you know, Trump was unpersuadable. And I think, you know, Netanyahu was pushing an open door there. But ultimately, this war in Iran is what Netanyahu wanted, because he's wanted this for a long time. And that's partially because Iran is genuinely a threat to Israel, as is Hezbollah and the other proxies, but also because Netanyahu is in such a tenuous domestic position and he's got an election coming up. And if he's not in office anymore, he's going to be indicted for corruption. So, you know, it's in his personal interest to have this war ongoing, and also in the interests of his government as well. So I think that when it comes to assigning blame, Trump is to blame because he has agency and he could have said no. But Netanyahu is also very much to blame, not only for the strikes in Iran, but also for what's happening in Lebanon. I mean, the strikes in Lebanon are purely the Israelis, and all of the death and damage that comes out of that is entirely the Israelis' fault.
But what can you argue that they have a need to do so because of Hezbollah, or Hezbollah is simply retaliating against Israel? Because I think what's happening with Netanyahu is his narrative over the past few decades is kind of falling apart a little bit. There was an interesting piece in Reuters 2 or 3 days ago discussing how Netanyahu's own efforts to bring various presidents into conflicts and to do the ultimate of toppling and ousting the biggest existential threat to Israel, which is the Islamic Republic. But now that's working against them because the US doesn't want anything to do with it. They're pressuring by willing to cut back entirely on military funding towards Israel. But on the other hand, the Israeli people now think that Netanyahu needs to continue the conflict in Lebanon because they are on the receiving end of the missile barrages and exchanges with Hezbollah, and by extension, the Iranians supporting them. What's your take on all that?
I mean, Hezbollah is a threat to Israel and to the Israeli people, and I do understand the need for Israel to get rid of that threat. And I know that the Israeli people, especially in the north of the country, have lived under constant barrages of attacks from Hezbollah for a long time. The problem with this is that Netanyahu always goes too far with this kind of thing. We've seen it in the horrendous things he's been doing in Gaza, and we're now seeing that in the south of Lebanon. He always pushes too far and does too much and takes things to a level of destruction that is not necessary. And what that means is that countries around the world that were supportive of Israel are now less and less supportive of Netanyahu. So although they may still be supportive of Israel as a country, as a nation, as a people, they don't support Netanyahu and his government because he's just gone too far for them to be able to do so. So you see that with not only European nations and other kind of Western democracies, but now with the US. And it's very unusual for the US to not be supporting Israel. I mean, the US has been Israel's closest ally for, since its creation, and has given it huge amounts of military aid and, supported it throughout. And this has been a very kind of cross-party, bipartisan thing that the US supports Israel. But now you see the Democrats in the US are really pulling back from their support for Israel because they don't feel able to provide that support given what Netanyahu was doing. And now we're starting to see the Republicans thinking the same thing as well. And this is so unusual. So essentially what Netanyahu has done is, by pushing too far, by killing so many people, and by spreading all of this destruction in Gaza and Lebanon, he has made it possible for people to view Israel as a pariah state. And that is leeching support away. And I think he's essentially shot himself in the foot, because without that kind of international support, he's going to be on a very precarious setting.
Yeah, I think the overreach is pretty evident. But I'm curious how you look at the blockade as well, because this has been something that after the intensity of March, we shifted to sort of a slow burner, if you like, of conflict. How much was that legal? And moreover, how effective was it? Because the one thing that I have struggled to really get ascertained clearly is whether the Strait of Hormuz was actually closed or not. And if it was largely closed, was it completely closed, or was there a trickle through of ships that were somehow sneaking through, or given the green light, the claims that the Iranians were letting through Chinese or Russian flagged ships? Could you break all that down?
So this is a really interesting area because having a blockade is a kind of ancient tactic, and we've had naval blockades in warfare since Athenian times. So it's not something that is kind of a novel operational concept for war. But this was interesting because there was a blockade of a blockade, which is a really interesting military concept. So Iran was essentially blockading the Strait of Hormuz, both with threats of missile and drone attacks on ships trying to run the blockade, and also with sea mines as well. So this meant that shipping, because for a commercial ship to be able to do a voyage, it needs to have insurance. And the insurance providers were essentially saying the risk is so high that we will either not insure you for this voyage, or we will make the insurance so expensive that it's essentially prohibitive to taking it. So this meant that shipping was essentially prohibited from going through the strait. And then we had the US Navy doing a blockade of Iranian ports. So they were blockading the blockade kind of slightly further out, which was really fascinating for us naval nerds, because I don't think we've seen that before. So that was stopping all shipping going in and out of Iranian ports. So not just with the strait, but kind of further south and out into the Gulf proper. So that means that we had a really complicated situation where shipping was not allowed by the Iranians, but then might not be allowed by the Americans. And then the Omanis were trying to, sort something out to get some ships out. And then that wasn't working. And it was just all so complicated. And these poor crews on the ship stuck in the Gulf, they had no idea when they were going to be able to get out, to be able to go home. A lot of them were kind of running low on food, and it was just an awful situation. And essentially what seems to be happening now is that Iran and Oman are going to be working out some kind of way of administering the strait. But whatever comes out of that is completely different to what was the status quo before, which was entirely free passage. So under, international law, you can always have free passage of ships through international waters. And that's exactly what was happening in the strait. So whatever happens with the outcome of this, whatever level of control Iran and Oman end up having over the strait, that is going to be a lot more than was in place before. And it means that Iran has not only the incentive, but also the ability to essentially close the strait whenever it wants, because it can say, oh, the ship has not complied with our requirements for navigational aids, or hasn't paid the administrative fee, or however they're going to phrase it, for the toll. And it will give Iran much more ability to be able to do that in the future. So this whole debacle has essentially taken a strait that was free passage and trade was going in and out perfectly happily, and made it limited. And it's really hard to know how limiting that was over the past couple of months, because a lot of ships were travelling through the strait with their AIS turned off. So that's their locator. And so if a ship has its AIS turned on, you can see what ship it is, where it's going and where it is. And they were turning those off because it makes it easier for them to be targeted by the Iranians. But also if a ship was making a kind of, dirty deal with the Iranians to be able to get through, they would not want that knowledge kind of broadcast publicly. So it's so difficult to know how many ships did get through, whether they did that by running the blockade or by paying the Iranians or by the Chinese making a deal behind closed doors. Like it's really difficult to know because there is no data.
So explain to me then, and everyone, if we can finally get to the bottom of this, what is the outcome of all of this in terms of the territorial borders? From my understanding beforehand, the Omanis and Iranians largely had an agreement. It's sort of like the Channel, really, isn't it, between the UK and France, that the border, if you like, it goes directly in the middle of the thoroughfare. But in this case, the Iranians just yesterday, if we bring it to contemporary events, got stroppy with the Omanis because the Omanis had tried to implement some corridor unilaterally, which the Iranians claimed violated the terms. So what is the condition of this now? Is it going to likely be that the Iranians control most of the Hormuz Strait and the Omanis sort of just have to accept that? Or it's going to be down the middle? Or like how are we actually going to see the space of the strait designated in terms of territorial control?
So the thing that would make the most sense to me is, so there were always kind of two main channels of shipping coming in and out of the strait. One's closer to Oman and one's closer to Iran. So what would make sense is for it to be split down the middle. Iran would have control of the northern one and Oman would have control of the southern one. That would make the most kind of fair sense if we're thinking about it like that. But the thing is that if it does turn out like that, then Iran won't necessarily have control over what's passing through the Omani channel, which kind of undermines what they were hoping for in terms of full control of the strait. So at the moment, Iran doesn't really have much incentive to accept a deal on the strait that isn't in its interests, because it can hold out a lot longer. It can close the strait completely for a lot longer. So I don't think that Iran will be incentivized to agree to a fair kind of 50-50 deal with Oman, because what the Iranian regime wants is to keep this going and extract more concessions from not only the Gulf nations, but from the US and Israel as well. So what I suspect will happen is that the MOU and the talks between Iran and Oman will kind of tootle on for a little while and then break down, because Iran has absolutely no incentive to get this sorted at the moment. So that's what I think will happen. I don't think, I think the strait will be open for a bit and then shut for a bit and then be open for a bit. And, all of this uncertainty about the future of the strait is going to cause huge problems for global shipping, even beyond the fact that the ships haven't been able to physically get through. So I think this will mean that, any insurance for going through the strait, even when it is open, is going to be really expensive because of the precarious situation there. So I think it means that, even if the strait is nominally open, it's not going to be back to normal for a very, very long time.
So we're in a perpetual state of instability then?
Yes, this is the world in 2026, I guess.
But what about this, just, I guess, looking ahead? We've had an interesting effort by the IMO, not the IMF, or WHO or something. Everyone, the UN actually does have a body called the International Maritime Organization. And another example, you'll hear me say it again, as a former UN employee, that the UN does have a role. And this is exactly where we have a role, where because no other nation state is going to be willing to make humanitarian actions to withdraw 11,000 sailors and staff, the UN is. But unfortunately, they've had to discontinue that because of the sustained escalation yesterday. There was a ship that I think was targeted. The UK Maritime Organization, I forget the acronym for it, was sharing information about that. So Emma, I guess just sort of as a sign off on this first half, what do you think the future does look like more specifically for humanitarian efforts or just civilian ships? Is it just a case we could see piracy happening, threats, sort of ships being boarded by Iranian, soldiers because of the leverage that they can gain? Is this just the way things are going to be now?
I think at the moment it is very hard to see an outcome that doesn't involve that kind of action. I think that any ship going through the strait is going to be under a lot of risk from the Iranians, whether that's from, missile and drone attacks if the conflict is escalating again, to essentially being, them sort of acting like bandits, if you want to pass through here, pay up kind of deal. Or, just them boarding and just being aggressive and intimidating and, kind of looking around and, throwing the captain's stuff around and then, kicking over a chair and leaving. They have a lot of leverage over the strait at the moment, and they have a lot of reason to keep this going. So I think that is going to really impact shipping through the strait. And I think the longer this uncertainty goes on, the more kind of complicated risk is going to be present. And I think the more we will see things like piracy, because once kind of order breaks down in an area, that's where, criminals and pirates thrive. So I think there is a huge risk of that kind of activity being seen as well.
But sorry, I know I keep saying last question, but very last question simply. Is this meaning that we're returning to a world, an order whereby the perceived peace of maritime security and stability is just no longer there? I don't think enough people appreciate just how much the United States has sort of been in the background, the guarantor of shipping lanes and the capacity to exert influence in a way that the Chinese, no other country has such a constant maritime global presence in that way.
Yeah, I mean, these kind of duties, so constabulary duties, freedom of navigation operations, those are the backbone of the US Navy. The US Navy's been doing them for decades and decades. And this is really like a foundational concept for the US Navy. And yeah, you're right. I don't think people realize how much global freedom of navigation has been underwritten by the US for the last 100 years. So the thing that we're seeing now is not necessarily that the US won't do that. It is just that the US will do it when Trump thinks it's in his interests too. So it's a much more conditional mission now, I think. So I don't think it means that we will see full lawlessness, but I think we also cannot rely on the US in the same way that we could before this Trump administration, because I think he will look at interventions in naval operations on a very case-by-case basis and a very mercurial basis. So if, say, China was going to be pushy again in the South China Sea or with Taiwan, the US would normally respond to that, and the US Navy would respond to that to underpin freedom of navigation. But now we would have to think, what will Trump do? What decision will he make? Because it's going to be on a very case-by-case basis. And I think that's the big shift. And I think, when we do eventually have a new president in the White House, it will be a really big question of whether that new president will go back to what the US Navy was doing prior, or will keep some of this kind of changeability in US decision-making.
Wow. Well, on that precarious note, everyone, will see you in the second half. Thanks for watching, and of course, do like and subscribe.
Russia cannot currently export its oil due to international sanctions, but it has this kind of huge fleet of either unflagged or, differently flagged ships that are actually Russian cargo ships that are exporting its oil. So that's another kind of interesting facet of the war here that I think is quite novel, which has been causing some problems for other navies as well.